Important to be able to control the cell cycle. If it's not controlled, we can actually end up with cancer. And when we get cancerous cells, they can actually divide, and then we end up with a tumor somewhere in the body. And that could actually be deadly. To control the cell cycle, we do have some checkpoints in the cell cycle. And those are controlled by what I call red lights and green lights. So here we just have the cell cycle, and you can see during interphase, we do have some checkpoints here where the cell will be stopped and it will be checked to make sure that there's no DNA mutations and that it's done the things that it's supposed to have done in order to get ready to move to the next part of the cell cycle. And so you can see there's another checkpoint here before it moves into go into mitosis. And then there's also another checkpoint during mitosis as well. And so these are where you can get your red lights and green lights to tell the cell, hey, no, things are not right, you need to stop, you can't go forward, or you get the green light, and then yes, you can go forward. So here's just a picture of this showing that everything checked out with the cell. There's no DNA damage. The cell has done everything it should have done to prepare to go to the next step in the cell cycle, and so it gets the green light to go ahead and proceed. But if something is not correct, then it can get the red light, and then it says, nope, you can't proceed, and so it will stop and not go on through the cell cycle. Okay, so this is an important idea. So if a cell has damaged DNA that it's not able to repair, there are repair mechanisms that can be done, but maybe the damage is just so bad that it can't repair it. The cell will get a signal to undergo what's called apoptosis. It's kind of a weird name, but apoptosis just means that the cell will be told to commit suicide. So it will kill itself, which is kind of a cool idea to think about. But the body just realizes that, hey, that cell is just too damaged, we can't fix it, so we got to get rid of it. And so it just gets the signal to kill itself and commit suicide, and so that's called apoptosis. But if we have a cell that has that damaged DNA that can't be repaired and it ignores that apoptosis signal and it doesn't kill itself and it just continues to divide, then it becomes a cancer cell, and that's not good. So these cancer cells just ignore all the check signals, they ignore the red lights, and they just keep on going around and around the cell cycle. And so they don't stop dividing. They just keep dividing and making more and more cells, and those cells just keep building up, and then you got this big tumor. And they also ignore those signals for doing apoptosis. They don't commit suicide either. So here's just an example of one of the red lights that we have in our cell cycle. This is called the p53 gene. It produces this protein called p53. And this p53 protein will check the cell for any DNA damage. And if it finds that, it says, hey, you need to go and repair that DNA damage. And if the cell is able to do that, then great. Then the cell will get a green light once it's repaired its DNA damage and then proceed to the next checkpoint. But if the cell can't repair that DNA damage, then the p53 protein will give that cell the signal that it needs to commit suicide and do that apoptosis. But if you've got a mutated p53 gene and that p53 protein is no longer working, it will not stop those cells that have DNA damage. And so those cells just keep on going around the cell cycle, and they also ignore the signals for apoptosis. And so those cells become cancerous. And so in about half of our patients that are diagnosed with cancer, they do have a mutation in this p53 gene, and that can lead to cancer. You don't have to memorize this p53 protein or gene, but it's just giving you an example. I'm not going to ask you about that on the test.